going to start by welcoming you once again to Parapsychology Foundation Lyceum Presents Parapsychology Lyceum Forum Physical Mediumship. Rosemarie Pilkington has been interested in psychic phenomena since childhood. As a young adult, she immersed herself in articles, books, and journals on the subject and attended seminars and lectures sponsored by the American Society for Psychical Research. She earned a PhD in psychology in consciousness studies from Saybrook Graduate University. She is the author of The Spirit of Dr Bindelof, and I believe I will be putting the link to that book in Amazon into the chat in a minute. She also compiled and edited the anthology Men and Women of Parapsychology Personal Reflections, essays and interviews from leading parapsychologists eliciting why they had entered the field, what they felt was important, and so on. This really wonderful reference book was reissued as a spree, Men and Women of Parapsychology Personal Reflections, Volume 1, in 2010 by Anomalous Books, and it's available in Kindle, ebook, and paperback and hardback. A second volume, Men and Women of Parapsychology Personal Reflections, a spree, Volume 2, was published in 2013. Her books have received critical praise and are considered important additions to the parapsychological literature. And if you're interested at all in how people come to spend a lifetime on this type of material and maybe get some ideas if you're interested in getting into research, and as well, the two books are an excellent resource.
Thank you. First of all, I want to thank the PF and Lizette for having me here. I just watched Carlos's presentation, and I must say that it's a very hard act to follow, but my case kind of comes out of that one. Okay, this is a quotation. There's no doubt that certain events recorded at seances are genuine. The author has actually seen a table rise, and Dr. Joshua Flegel of Harvard attended a seance in which a table not only rose, but excused itself and went upstairs to sleep. And of course, that's by the famous Woody Allen. Woody Allen knows quite a bit about this field. But the attitude of most people is one of humor. They think these things don't really happen, the things that go bump in the night. And if you talk to many people about this kind of thing, they poo-poo it. I'm going to talk today about my favorite subject. This was my friend Gilbert Roller. I met Gil in the 1970s. He was teaching a course at the time at the New School in New York. The course was called Paramechanics, and what he meant by that was PK. I took the course with the man I then later married, who also had a lot of ability, and I'll tell you about him later. But Gil, I found out later after we became friends, was the center of poltergeist activity when he was a kid, probably just starting to go into puberty. It took the form of throwing things around the house, throwing hairpins. His mother had beautiful hair that she kept up in like a Gibson do, so she had lots of hairpins. I'm going to skip the next and go down to crayon go on walls. She and her husband, I'll tell you more about them in a second, had a very rocky marriage, both very temperamental, and occasionally she would leave the house and go out someplace else to live. And they would come back and they'd find go written on the walls, like 3 feet, 4 feet high in crayon. No one had been in the apartment. No one was in the apartment, but these things would be there. Dishes would come crashing from the shelves. They named the force Liz, and they would say, Liz, throw hairpins, or Liz, do something, and something would happen as they asked it to. Now, this is Gil and his stepfather, Eddie Fink. Eddie Fink was quite an interesting character. He was a minor celebrity in New York. He was a pianist and musician. He played for years at the old Luch House restaurant. And he was the only father that Gil knew as a stepfather, but he knew it wasn't his natural father. He didn't find out about his natural father until he was in his teens. And that's important when you try to find the genesis of who Bindelof was. That there were many boys in the group who had absentee or emotionally absent fathers. So this was Eddie Fink, and this is around the time, I guess, that Gil was involved with the poltergeist outbreaks in his apartment. As you can see, he looks to be about maybe 12 years old, 13 years old, something like that. Now comes the greatest influence in Gil's life. This was Olga, his mother, Olga Roller. Olga Roller was not her real name. It was her stage name. And actually, it wasn't Gil's real name, although he used it throughout his life. His legal name was Guerico. His father, his natural father, was an Argentinian naval officer who evidently was in the United States buying battleships for his government. And he met Olga, who was very beautiful, as you can see here. She was also very glamorous. This was a picture of her in Victor Herbert's Eileen. She originated the character of Lady Maud, I think her name was. She had a beautiful voice, very temperamental. She was on the road lots of times, most of the time, in different productions here and in Europe. And she took Gil with her. Gil was very close to her. So Gil never had public schooling or formal schooling. He was tutored and went to private schools. She was his greatest influence, I think, throughout his life. She was also very interested in psychic phenomena. She had a tremendous library of scientific books, which Gil availed himself of as he grew up. She sat backstage. Part of their entertainment for themselves was to sit and have table turning or little seances. And some of her friends early on were the Dolly sisters, who later became very famous. And she used to sit with them. Gil's first seance was interesting. One of the times that they left the household, when she left Eddie for a while, she went to stay with friends that she had sat with before. And in the seances she had had before, nothing really spectacular ever happened, but they got movements, I guess, and some raps. Now, Gilbert, of course, was just a kid, and this was his first sitting. They sat in Manhattan somewhere in a darkened room. Windows were closed, blinds were down to keep out most of the light. And they hadn't sat for long when suddenly the curtains started to billow away from the closed windows. And then, just as one of the cases that Carlos mentioned before with the Palladino, where furniture started moving away from the walls, that happened in that room too. A large, heavy easy chair came toward them from the wall, and they got kind of spooked by it, and they stopped the seance. But that was Gil's very first seance. So much like Indridason and some of the other people, his first seance was showed that there was some talent there, although he didn't do anything about it, of course, at that time. In around 1929, since he was alone, he really didn't have many friends. And he met this young man called Leonard Lauer, who went to Townsend Harris High School. Townsend Harris is still in New York. It is a school for very bright kids. In those days, it was just boys. And these kids were very, very precocious. They would be rushed through high school. They'd start at maybe 12 or something, and they were into college by the time they were 16 or 17. Gil had a little bit of a competition with this young man, as young men were wont to do. And Lenny was trying to show off, and he was talking about Mencken and things that he read. And Gil said, well, you know, I know something more important. And he started mentioning what he had read in the books in his mother's library. some of those books were by Hudson, Myers, Richer, Lombroso, Schrenk-Notzing, the people that Carlos just talked about. And Leonard was very skeptical, but he was wise enough to know that these were very important scientists and what they had to say was important. So he started reading some of the books as well, and they decided to experiment, to try to get a table to do something. They were afraid that their parents wouldn't approve, so when Len's parents were out, they used his apartment, and they got a simple bridge table, put it on the floor, rolled back the carpets, and sat, not knowing what to do, just kind of sat and asked if there was anyone there or something. They didn't know what they were doing, but they sat across from each other, had their hands touching, and little by little they started to get movement. And then little tilting, where the table would kind of tilt a little bit. Eventually, they got a sort of levitation. I don't know if it was a complete levitation. There's a little discrepancy about that. But they were too excited about what they did get to keep a lid on it. And so I think the following year or so, Lenny, who knew a lot of people at Townsend Harris High School, asked this fellow Larry Levin, to join them. And Larry was very enthusiastic about it, and they started working, the three of them, with the bridge table, and they got not only movement and slidings, but finally they got levitation. And the table went so high that Larry, who was shorter than the other two, couldn't reach the top of it. So he pulled on the leg or something. That kind of broke the spell, and the table came down. Then they had to explain why there was a broken table in the house. What they did then was to, after a while, it went on for, I think the following year, the next term, Lenny started to invite other classmates of his, kids who were just as bright as they were. And one of the people was Montague Ullman. Now, most of you probably know Montague Ullman became a well-known parapsychologist, especially in the work of dreams, and set up the Dream Laboratory at Maimonides, did so much important work with telepathy and dreaming. And they decided to have much more regular meetings, to document their meetings. They kept minutes. They were all very bright, so they knew what they were doing pretty much. Once they started having regular meetings, the phenomena became more consistent. They got raps, some spelling out messages with the ABC system. And since Gil was a Renaissance man, he played many instruments, he played the piano, he composed music. He was an artist, wonderful artist. But he was also a photographer, very much interested in photographing. And he asked about if they wanted to see if they could get anything on film. Now, in those days, what he used were the emulsion-covered glass plates. This was not soft film that we use today. And they knew enough to control. They would go to the store together to buy a new package of these plates, bring them back to Gil's apartment. Now they were using his bedroom as the seance room. And they set up a little dark room in the bathroom. And they would go in 2 or 3 of them together to open the plates together. And they put the glass plate in a light-proof metal container. And then they put it on the table, and they sat in the dark room around the table and kind of waited for something to happen, and nothing happened. And they said, well, what are we taking a picture of? Well, somebody put his hand on the metal casing, and they waited a while, and nothing happened, and they pushed it aside, and they decided to try to get a message, and they got raps spelling out Plate, and to them that meant they better develop it. So they ran into the darkroom and developed it, and what came out was a shadowgraph of a hand. It didn't look like a negative, it looked like a positive, as though there were a ray of light had shone down on the hand and left its impression. Well, of course, that shouldn't have happened at all, because this was in the dark and it was a light-proof container. Well, they did several of these, and Monty, who was always the kind of skeptical one, put his thumb on the top of the hand of the boy who was holding whose hand was on top of the plate. And when they developed that one, you can see, I don't have a slide of it, unfortunately, but you can see the hand with Monty's thumb on the back of it. So he proved to himself that there was nothing that could have been set up, even though he knew that they had all opened the packages together and all were watching everything. And then they took keys and put them on, and sure enough, the shadowgraph came with the keys, etc. They decided to move on from there to thought photography. Now, of course, this is way before Ted Sirius. The first thing they decided to think of was a milk bottle. And I think it was Larry who they took the plate and put it against his head or some such thing, with, not knowing what they were doing. When they developed it, they got the picture that you see on the left-hand side here. It was not a milk bottle, it was an iodine bottle. Now, you can't see it well in this slide, but in the original, you could actually read part of the label, and it was an iodine bottle that came from a local pharmacy, and I'm sure they all had one in their in their medicine cabinets. However, remember, this is not soft film. This is a hard glass plate. It looks a little bit almost in the original as though it were bent, and of course you couldn't bend the picture in this. Then they tried to think of a person, and there was a girl that Larry had met named Olympia. None of the others had met her. So again, he put the plate up against Larry's head, and they concentrated on Olympia. And when they developed it, what they got was the picture on the right. And they looked at it and they said, well, it looks sort of like a girl, but it's not quite, And then Gil recognized it as an amulet that his aunt, who was only 6 months younger than he was, had brought him back from out west someplace. They didn't know where it was. Eventually it was found someplace in the house. But so it seemed right from the beginning that Gil seemed to be influencing these photographs or whatever, perhaps more than the others were. After a while, they got tired of the ABC business of spelling out messages and things. They were impatient. They were boys, after all. And they had read, of course, in Hudson's book about slate, automatic writing, direct writing. And so they asked whoever their communicant was, could they get written messages? And the answer came back, I think one knock meant yes, so they got a yes answer. And so what they did was they put plain paper, foolscap, on a shelf. Oh, I forgot to tell you, they had stopped using the bridge table because they were in Gil's very small bedroom, crowded around it. There was no room for a bridge table. So they used this tiny nightstand, which had an open shelf on it about 6 or 8 inches below the top of it. And they put foolscap on that shelf and a pencil, put out the lights, sat around with their fingers touching each other, their knees and feet touching each other, and they could hear the pencil kind of, it rose and slapped itself down, and then maybe a little scratching or whatever, and they started getting little scratches or words or something, and little by little it evolved so that they were actually getting messages. The picture on the left is, you can see that the paper is wrinkled, and if you notice that it's also folded kind of. Some of the messages that they got eventually were when the message would be relayed, hear the pencil writing quickly, very, very quickly. And they could hear the dotted I's. It was very audible in this quiet room. And then sometimes the paper would be scrunched up into a ball. They would then put on the light and dig it out, and they would have to open it and sometimes it was folded and then scrunched, and then they could read the message. And many of these messages, most of them were spontaneous answers to questions that they had or comments. Some of them were long messages, and you'll see those in a while. The picture on the right shows you where they used two pieces of paper. Maybe I should get that arrow, but anyway, you can see the line going down, and it says, don't use pills too frequently. Now, what happened was don't, and the beginning of pills got written on the top piece of paper. The use got written on the bottom piece of paper with the two, and frequent, and then the rest of the word probably was written on the table. So it ran over off the paper onto the table. Now, we talked about raps before. They got different kinds of raps. They answered yes or no, and to say, to spell out words. But they noticed that before a certain main communicant appeared or gave the messages, they got what they came to call the staccato. What it was very similar to a drum roll. It was a very quick brrr sound that would grow a crescendo and then bang, a great big bang. Now, they tried to imitate this manually. They could never do it. Even Gil, who was an accomplished pianist, couldn't get that drum roll kind of sound on the table with his fingers, and certainly not the loud sound that came from the final blow. Even if they could. I mean, the room they worked in was never completely dark. They were in uptown Manhattan, after all. And in Manhattan, you never get a completely dark room. So they could see each other's outlines. They could see sometimes expressions, whatever. It wasn't a dark room. If anybody got up or made any kind of strange movements, they would see it. But of course, when the staccato, as they called it, happened, they didn't see anybody moving. So it couldn't have been something that one of them did. Eventually, they, in one of the messages, this entity identified himself as a Dr. Bindelof. And he said his purpose was to continue healing after he died, that he was in life a physician, and that after his passing he wanted to continue healing. And he asked them very grandly to be the disciples of a dead man. Well, they were all very impressed. Dr. Bindelof always wrote the messages in block script, as you can see on this long message. I cannot thank you enough for the way you, he aided me last week. It was this kind of speech that he used. And in this message, as you can see, he is giving them a diagram of a device which they might construct at a nominal cost so that he might be able to speak with them. They had evidently read about direct voice, and they wanted to try that. And so this was one way that they thought they could do it. Actually, they made the device with rubber tubing and a large funnel or whatever, and they did try to use it at a subsequent meeting in the minutes that they very carefully took minutes and approved them at each meeting. The minutes said that they heard kind of blowing from it, sort of whispering sounds, but no real words. So they kind of gave up on that and put it aside for a while. I just lost my mouse. Okay, here it is. And of course, the apex of this photography that they did was the portrait. On the cover of the book, you'll see this portrait. They asked him if they could have his picture, so they would know what he looked like. And he gave them written instructions. It wasn't just the portrait. He gave them written instructions for some other pictures as well. It was supposed to be picture of energies, I think it was. And he had said to them, tonight, I'll read out to you what he said. Tonight, in view of the fact that we have so much to do, we must not spend too much time on any one experiment. The photography requiring the most energy would best be done first. Let me explain a little more in detail what I want done. First, I shall attempt to give you a picture of myself. Process 1. Use full aperture in total darkness. Total is underlined. 2. Set focus for 5-foot point focal clarity to be at the center of the table. 3. Set plate, remove cover. 4. Open lens in total, again underlined, darkness for a period of 20 to 30 seconds. 5. Develop. Second picture of common force. That's what they asked for. And he gave them different ones. Universal focus, distance enough to include the entire group. This kind of looks ahead also to the serious photos where you have people in the background and then something else going on. And he gave them other technical instructions. And then a picture of outside identities he was supposed to give. Well, those kind of a little bit strange, but portrait is not. What they got after they developed the picture was this. And if you notice, it doesn't look like an actual photo. It's blurry. It's very grainy, very kind of, there are striations along, if you look to the left side of Bindelof's face, the striations. Those are characteristics of thought photographs, the kind of photographs that Ted Sirios and others produced, where you have these fuzzy outlines and the striations and the graininess. Now, who was this person? When I was at Gil's apartment one time, there was a young fellow there, and Gil pulled out one of the original prints that he had of Bindelof, which I had not seen. It was much clearer than the one that I had been given. And the fellow said, you know, Gil, this looks a little bit like you. Well, I looked at it, and the cheekbones kind of, you know, it sort of vaguely resembled. It doesn't really look like him, but you might say a vague resemblance. But of course, Gil at that time was only in his teens, and this is a picture of an old man with a mustache and a beard. But of course, I thought, well, you know, Kliski and Katie, Florrie Fox, whatever, produced phantoms that looked like themselves. Very often that happens, it seems. Kliski did until somebody pointed it out to him, and then they stopped resembling him. But it's very possible that Gil was producing an image that looked something like him. At any rate, were these things needed, these directions? I don't think so. Did they need to put their hands over the place before or hold them up to their heads? I don't think so either. I think much like Ted Sirios, these were photographs. They came, whether they had done them by putting the plate on the table or by using the camera and opening the lens for 30 seconds or whatever. I don't think it was necessary. I think this is what they thought that they might have to do, or at least maybe Gil did, because he seems to be the medium of the group. At any rate, this fantastic portrait was produced, and I can tell you that 50 years afterwards, I mean, they looked at it and they could not believe that that they had produced it, but they knew they had. It was very, very difficult for them to even to imagine that they had done it. By the way, Larry, who always believed that Dr. Bindelof was real spirit and was overlooking his life and guiding him, etc., carried this picture of Dr. Bindelof around with him until he died, and he died just a few years ago. As a matter of fact, this year would be Larry's and Monty Ullman's 100th birthday. Gil would have been 100 last year. He was born in 1915. Monty and Larry were born in 1916. Now here are two other messages. As you can see, the one on the left is a very long one, and you can see the old fool's cap, and it's written in Dr. Bindelof's block letters. That number 1 over on the upper left-hand side was written by Monty Ullman, I think, just to identify that that was the first one of that particular evening, perhaps. Some of there's comments or answers to questions as the second one. Now notice the second one is written in script, not in block print. That means that it was not answered by Dr. Bindelof. Dr. Bindelof also had friends, evidently. One identified himself as a Dr. Rinchner. Dr. Rinchner would appear after 5 knocks. They would hear a series of 5 knocks, and then the next message would be by Dr. Rinchner. We'll also find another person communicating with him. But they also communicated with, I think, the man on the moon or something. No, it was a man from Mars. That was. And Arthur Conan Doyle. Of course, everybody communicates with Arthur Conan Doyle. Okay, so here's Dr. Rinchner on the left. I am a friend of the doctor, it says. And then the word weak, evidently an answer to the force that night or some question that they asked. On the right is the other communicant who kept showing up. This communicant was very strange. He called himself Bad, and as you can see, he wrote his name Bad in script, but otherwise he printed. So he was a combination of the two. And he was always asking if he could participate, if he could take their place. It was like a kind of Tarzan, Eugene, but he was like a lower entity, a lower spirit. And this message says both something here now, or he was here now, but he was always begging to take part and to help them out when they were having difficulty. It was kind of typical teenage stuff too. They had their little I don't know, kind of nastiness toward each other sometimes, or putting one person out, or one person could stay in and one person had to leave, and it was a very kind of typical teenage group. Some of the messages were very interesting in that they would be in mirror writing. The one on the left, as you can see, there were 2 actually. Don't ask me what they say. I don't know. I remember looking at them with a mirror one time and probably figuring it out, but right now I can't do that. Then towards the end, actually one of the last messages they got, before they broke up, a message came through saying there is no sense sitting. It's the one in the upper left-hand corner. And you can see it wasn't very clear and kind of words running into each other. Well, they were not very happy with that, and I think it was either Larry or Lenny said, well, we don't understand why you're saying that. Could you clarify it? And they got another message. I put the 3 of them together here. But this time, the one on the bottom, I believe it is they got a message written much more clearly. There is no sense sitting. Again, they said, well, no, that's not what we meant. We wanted you to explain further. Could you elaborate? And so what came back was a literal elaboration. Where up on the right-hand corner, you can see the curlicues, where the same message is given very stubbornly, but in a much more elaborate way of writing. So there's very literal interpretation of that. Now, Carlos talked a lot about ectoplasm before, and it's been asked, did the boys see ectoplasm as well? Of course, they had read all those books and about all those people that Carlos talked about Katie King, and Gil especially was quite taken with the Crooks and Hume and Katie King, etc. They did see shadows passing over. In those days, they wore radium dial watches, which of course we know now are very dangerous, but you could see them in the dark. And they would see like a shadow of a hand or an arm or something passing over the radium watches. They were also touched quite a bit by spirit hands. Their clothes would be pulled or their hair would be pulled. They would be sometimes tapped or whatever. One day, they felt their hands being taken. Sometimes the hand would be taken from the table, put underneath the table, or vice versa. And the message they got was that Dr. Bindelof was going to come around and touch all their hands. And Gil got very nervous, and he said, when it comes around, I'm going to grab it or something. And suddenly, they heard this loud slap. And I think it was Lenny who was sitting across from Gil. And of course, as I said, in those rooms, you could see them. They could see each other's faces, actually. He saw Gil's head get jerked back. And they immediately put on the light, and Gil had this red mark like a hand had slapped him on the face, and he felt that he had been slapped by a hand. But of course, nobody's hand had moved. They were all holding each other's hands, and if anybody had raised his hand and actually slapped him, it would have been visible. As I said, it was not a dark room. It was just a darkened room. Bindelof, in his role as healer, very often touched them and manipulated them. One time, I forget who it was, one of the boys had problems with his eyes, and he felt that, he said he felt he being massaged behind his eyes. They also felt pressure on their forehead. They felt hands touching their heads, etc. Howard, a very quiet person, wrote later on about an experience. He said he had a headache, but he wasn't sure if he really had a headache or he just wanted some attention. But he said the room was so small that he was sitting with his back almost against the wall. Nobody could have gone behind him, and yet he felt the hands come from behind him. And he said they were very gentle but firm. He felt the fingers massaging the top of his head, and kind of moving his head from side to side. And then, as the Bindelof or whatever would always do, not always, but very often do, tap him on the head before leaving. One night, Ellie was Gil's aunt, as I said before. She was actually 6 months younger than he was. But she had gone to the dentist, and she came home. She lived in the same apartment with them, and had a toothache. The tooth was hurting her. Well, they decided they didn't have the regular group there. This was not a Saturday night that they had a regular meeting. But Olga came in and sat with them, Gil's mother, and Gil was there, and I forget who else was there, but it wasn't the usual group. However, they sat, and when the lights went out, she said she felt a non-human finger touch her cheek, then penetrate, press underneath the aching tooth, and the pain went away. Well, that was quite something. I interviewed her many years later, and I said, well, Ellie, if it didn't feel like a human finger, what did it feel like? And she thought a second. She said, like a hot dog casing filled with warm air. That's what it felt like to her. Others, though, felt him, Bindelof's fingers on their head, it felt like fingers, but very gentle and yet strong. Of course, Gil didn't feel gentle when he got slapped, but that's a different thing. But there was lots of healings that were done. A very funny one on Mrs. Lauer, Lenny's mother, where she actually gave a great big belch because she had stomach problems, and they all had to try not to laugh, but they enjoyed it anyway, and she seemed to be much helped by it. Now, they also had heard about direct voice, and being the intrepid people that they were, they decided to try again. They had tried with the device that Bindelof had told them how to make some time ago. Now, by this time, this was one of the last sessions. Montague Ullman had already left the group. He went to medical school. He was very young, I think 16 or so. And he went off to medical school, and he had before been the person who took the minutes all the time. And now a woman who had, a girl named Marion Meader, who had joined the group, was taking the minutes. And when I was going to write this book, Monty didn't want me to put this into the story. And indeed, he did not put it into his account. He did an account, which any of you can look up, for Rhea White's EHE, and I think it was also published in the JASPR. He doesn't even mention this. And I argued with him. I said, but Larry, it's in the meeting, in minutes. And, I'm sorry, Monty, it's in the minutes. And you told me that if something is in the minutes, then it was, always verified, the next meeting, etc. He said, but I wasn't there. I didn't take the minutes. So he became just as skeptical as any stranger when it came to something that was different, that he had not experienced. So it was kind of an interesting thing. So, at any rate, the minutes said that they heard voices from a megaphone. They had made a megaphone on the spot, and the megaphone was levitated and was kind of flying around the room. And then it came like next to somebody's ear, and they would hear, hello, Larry, hello, Gil, hello, this, whatever. Nothing important. And when I asked Larry about it, because I interviewed Ellie, and I interviewed Larry about this, and I think Howard as well. Larry said, well, it wasn't really speaking, it was whispering. We heard names whispered in our ear. But he said nothing important. It was just, hellos and how are yous and things like that. Later in the evening, they had their session, and then later in the evening, Ellie came in. She had been out, and they sat down again so that Ellie could hear too. And she also heard, hello, Ellie, etc., whispered in the megaphone. However, they never tried it again. That was, I said, one of their last meetings before the group kind of broke up. They were all interested by that time in other things. Monty had gone off to medical school. Gil had to make his life. He wanted to go to art school and was interested in other things. Larry had joined a group. He had met a woman that he later married, Flo, and they were very much involved in kind of politics, but also there was a drama group, and Larry was a budding actor. He was in Eva Le Gallienne's workshop early on, and there was a drama group that he wanted to be in, which also met on Saturday nights, so he was kind of torn. So what happened was they grew up, and the group broke up. So they never got a chance to repeat it or to build on what they had already done. Now, Monty kept all the records, the meetings, all the asides, etc. And what he did was to have periodic reunions. He would even pay for people to fly in, and they would meet. This picture was taken in the 1960s, I believe, or maybe, probably the 1960s. On the far left is Montague Ullman. Next to him is Larry. Larry's name, by the way, was Larry Levin. Later on, he changed it to Gilbert Lawrence, which is a long story. You'll find it if you read my book. It's a long story about it. And next to Larry, who's got his arm around him, is Leonard Lauer. Unfortunately, I never met Leonard Lauer. The day I was supposed to go and interview him, he died of a heart attack. Monty called me that morning and said and told me the news. However, Leonard had made a tape for his family about the Bindelof experience, and I used that to fill in some of the gaps in the very early days. The man next to him, kind of stoop-shouldered, is Howard Fish, who owned a bookstore. He was very, very quiet, very intellectual. He was the one who said he was sitting with his back against the wall when he felt the fingers on his head. The man next to him is George Kaiser, who also wrote extensively in his reports, etc., about the healings and touchings. And on the far right is Gil Roller, very good-looking, tall man. He was really the whole impetus, I think, and behind the whole thing. This is a picture. I think I took this one. Again, on a rooftop, the two Gils, meaning that Larry, who's in the center, I always called him Larry, but he had changed his name, as I said, to Gilbert Lawrence, and so people called him Gil, including the lady on his left, who was his second wife, Pat, and that was Gil on the right, Gil Roller. They're standing on the roof, or actually the penthouse of the Des Artistes building, where Gil and Marion Roller lived when I met them. Now, who was Bindelof? So many people keep asking me, well, was he really a spirit? You know, and they believe that he was, and or was he made up? Did he ever exist? Well, at the time, in the 1930s, the boys tried to trace, to find out if there was ever such a physician who lived by this name. They could find, and later on I did computer searches, we could find no such name as Bindelof. It seems to be that it was a name that was out of their imaginations, especially probably Gil's. So no trace was ever found of anyone who answered the description of Dr. Bindelof. Certainly not a Rinchner or a Bad. Well, who was he? What need would he fill in these boys if he was made up? As I said before, Gil never knew his real father. He had a stepfather who loved him, and he loved him, but I guess it wasn't the same. The others either had no father or fathers who were absent, perhaps traveling salesman, I think, the way Larry's was, or emotionally absent, the way I think Monty's was. So he really might have filled a need, and this is what they concluded as well, that he might have filled a need for a father figure. They were young, intellectual, idealistic kids, not interested in contacting deceased loved ones. They hadn't lost anybody close to them that they wanted to contact. They were more interested in scientific exploration. So you really wouldn't expect them to be contacting Aunt Susie or departed such and such. And I think very much like the Philip group later on in the 20th century, it's kind of something that was made up. Of course, the Philip group did this purposely. They set out to make up a ghost that they could focus on. These young people didn't do it consciously, but I think it came out of their unconscious or subconscious. Gil was a very compassionate person. He loved especially animals. He had a great respect and admiration for all living things. I'd seen him with his animals, cats, for instance, really taking care of them so that the way a vet would, or whatever. And amongst his things after he died, I found a story that he wrote as an adult, but it's kind of autobiographical. He lived up on the Upper West Side, as you know, and it's about, as a boy, walking near the edge of the Hudson River on the rocks and seeing a rat who was ill. And this animal that is so repugnant to most people, he felt such compassion for, and the desire to heal this poor thing, and it dies, and his hands or on his had crawled over to his foot as if it was looking for help, and he felt so unhappy because he couldn't help this little rat. If you want to read the story, it's on my website, ourspiritsreal.com. I'll give you the URL at the end of the presentation. But I think it gives a lot of understanding as to why Bindelof was created and who he was. The staccato drum roll, I think, is also indicative. After all, Gil is from a theatrical background. His mother was a Broadway star back in the early 1900s. His stepfather was a musician. As I said, he was in with show business people all the time. He knew Mencken. He knew many of the big names of the day. Interesting little aside, if I may, with Eddie Fink. Eddie was Jewish, and he was working at Bindelof's for many years. And at the beginning of the Nazi reign in Germany, he was let go because he was Jewish. And Walter Winchell, who was very powerful at the time, heard about it, probably knew Eddie, as many people did, and started a big fuss on the radio, etc., so that he was hired back again. They took him back again. But that's just a little piece of history. At any rate, so the staccato was like a drum roll, very theatrical. Boom, and here comes the main act, you know. Also, the name Bindelof, it looks like a combination of German and Russian or something. Now, Augereau was born in Vienna. Gil's nanny spoke German. So he was, you know, kind of with a Germanic background. He was also a lover of Rachmaninoff. That was his favorite composer. So who knows, that Bindelof could have come out of his imagination. I'm pretty sure that's where it came from. Oh, I put this in here. These were the things that they read about. Of course, all the things that Carlos talked about in his talk before. And I put this picture here because in my book, there's a mistake. Hate to admit it, but we mislabeled. This is Stanislava P, and we had it labeled as Eva C, which of course was wrong. And of course there's Palladino. And of course these guys had read all this stuff, and so it was paramount in their minds. This is what they were trying to do. One of the most influential books was Hudson's The Law of Psychic Phenomena. I don't know if you can see it, but this is actually the copy that was on Gil's shelf that they all read. So it's kind of falling apart, but I have that. That's one of my little treasures. Hudson was very, very astute. And I don't know what he wrote about spirits, etc., in his later books. I frankly haven't read them that awful, I have to admit that. But in this book, on chapter 15 on Spiritism, he displays a profound understanding of the subjective mind, is what he calls, and communication of two subjective minds. He says it is well known that anyone can as readily obtain a communication from an imaginary person as from a real one, providing the medium does not happen to know the facts. And that's true. And he seemed to understand the unconscious and that what telepathy actually was, and that we could communicate. So he didn't seem to be advocating the spirit phenomena, but he seemed to be more in tune with the living agent theory. So I think, as I said, I can't be sure of it, but he seemed to me, in this book at least, to be concluding that that this was not necessarily spirits, that it was the medium's living ability that was at work here. And he questioned, was there one inherent force or ability that is responsible for telepathy and psychokinesis? We don't know. We do know that these phenomena that happen inside the seance room very often go outside the seance room when the people are all fired up with it. In the Philip case, that happened. In this case, there was some strong evidence. There were broken watch crystals, especially on Larry's watch. Larry seemed to have most of these things happening. He and Gil. There was an incident, I write about it in the book, where switched labels, they had labels in different envelopes that they would deliver to different stores, and these labels would get switched, and even though they were very, very sure they put them in the right envelopes, they would be switched, and the only thing they could figure was that this was the kind of poltergeist or whatever at work. Were these things caused by Larry plus Gil? We don't know. Larry seemed to have some ability too, although it was Gil who was the main medium, if you want to use that word. There was also an incident when they were young where they went into a tomb in downtown New York graveyard, and I think they felt they weren't really supposed to be there, and suddenly stones started to be thrown at them from inside the tomb, and of course they ran away. Now later in Gil's life, he was invited up to the apartment of, his name was Jonah. He was the artist who had done the Sinclair dinosaurs for the World's Fair in the 1960s, and his daughter wanted to try to contact him, so she knew of Gil's dabbling in these things, and he went up rather to their apartment. And they were in the kitchen, and they were standing around a table, moving around a table, and the table was moving, and Gil got very annoyed because he thought that some of the people were kind of jeering at it and were actually pushing the table. So he walked away from the table to the side of the room, and he turned around just in time to see stones falling from the ceiling onto the table. So that same kind of poltergeist-like activity seemed to be there. When he was young, kind of telling him he shouldn't be in the graveyard in this tomb, desecrating it or whatever, and then later on because he was angry with these people, so they were being stoned in a sense. So I think most of the phenomena were really generated by Gil. He seemed to be and he was the only one who always was at a meeting where something happened. The others tried sitting later on in their lives. Larry tried sitting with Hubert Carrington when he was in California and wasn't able to get anything. Monty tried sitting with other people, wasn't able to get it. But Gil did get some large phenomena. Again, more detail in the book. I'm running out of time, I think. So that it was pretty sure that Gil was the main one, even though I think Larry lent a lot of energy to the group. I think Gil was the main medium. Oh, I got ahead of myself, didn't I? Okay, so there's the evidence pointing to him, poltergeist outbreaks that he had as a kid. He was the only one who was at all sessions where the phenomena occurred. He was the only one who was able to get phenomena in adulthood, upstate New York. Then when I met him with my ex-husband, we did some experiments with transistor radios, which again you can read about in the book. I don't have time to talk about them here. Stones from the ceiling, and there were other unexplained happenings. What's it all about? Well, is it spirits or powers who taught herself how to move objects, etc.? Started spontaneously, but then became, I don't know. I'm being distracted right now. Felicia Parisi, a friend of mine now, who saw the Kulag in the films, and taught herself to move objects, and who makes a big deal if she's not doing anything with spirits. What is the role of consciousness? I think the role of consciousness is the answer. If we understand consciousness, will we understand these phenomena? The pattern seems to be people have spontaneous productions, and then they move into consciously being able to do that. So I think studying poltergeist cases is very important, and perhaps getting some of these people who are doing spontaneous things and trying to get them into doing some kind of conscious production. I'm seeing things over here about Frozen. I don't know if I'm coming through or not. Why don't people produce much ectoplasm anymore? Well, it's disgusting. People are not into that anymore. What's hot today are the electronic things, the EVP and other electronic phenomena, more suitable to the zeitgeist, metal bending, all those kinds of things. So we don't hear about ectoplasm so much anymore. This is Gil. He died in 2004. You can see he's with a cat upstate in his weekend home. And he just was a dear person, and I think we should not forget him. And here is my Spirit of Dr Bindelof, the Enigma of Seance Phenomena. And there should be there's my www. Oh, okay. Available from Amazon.com. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Rosemarie, very much. It was a really, really interesting presentation.
Hi there, I'm Lizette Coley. I'm president of Parapsychology Foundation, so welcome to our YouTube channel. We have lots to look at, so please check out our videos. Don't forget to subscribe. Thank you.